Welcome to Masechet Sanhedrin. Today we're going to be learning Sanhedrin Daf Bet. For those new, we'll learn today that the Gemara always starts on the second page, never on Daf Aleph. Not for today, but I want to just talk about, let's start with our sponsorships and then I'll give some introduction. Masechet Sanhedrin sponsored by Gina Davidovich in loving memory of her father, Vladimir Davidovich, Zev ben Yitzchak Lechan, on his first year at site. My father always encouraged my learning, was my greatest chavruta. He instilled within me and his many students a deep love of Torah. May his neshama have an aliyah. Today's stuff is sponsored by Norman Eliezer in honor of Shiur Eliezer's birthday. Thank you for being an amazing study buddy, in addition to being the best wife in the world. Today's stuff is sponsored by Lana Kersner and Adina Hajaj in memory of their grandmother, Ethel Walensky Greenstone, whose yahrzeit is this week. Although she passed away 79 years ago, her legacy lived on through her children. They passed on to us a hunger for learning, a quest for equal rights for women in scholarship, and an analytic spirit that spans the generations. We believe that she would have taken such joy knowing that two of her granddaughters bear her name and her spirit as I learned Daf Yomi virtually across oceans together. That's not inspiring. Don't know what is. So welcome to Masechet Sanhedrin. I assume we have some new people here who might not have started learning until today with us anyway. So I would like to welcome you, and I would like to just give you some facts and information that would be helpful to know about us. First of all, you can subscribe either to the podcast, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, you can subscribe to our WhatsApp groups and get the links both to my shiurim, and there's lots of shiurim called Beyond the Daf, different categories. We even have some new ones that just started, which is intended to, you'll see that Daf Yomi learning is very on the surface. We try to go a little under the surface here and there, but it's very quick paced and not a lot of in-depth. And what the Beyond the Daf content does is it provides some in-depth once a week shiurim in different areas, to go in-depth into something. And highly recommended to once in a while when you have time to listen. They're also available on podcasts. They're also available on YouTube and on our website. And there's also Shuli Mishkan's content, which is written. So you can always print that out. Usually it comes out often at the end of the week. You can print it out for Shabbat. Anyway, there's lots of other content besides just Daf Yomi, and there's different ways you can learn. There's a getting started page, which shows you can start with some introductory courses. We have both courses of background. We have courses that provide ability to learn skills of Gemara, really delve in with chavruta learning that you can do on your own with a chavruta or on your own with guided study sheets that you can really start trying to tackle the text yourself. Daf Yomi is a little more, actually not my main style of learning that I like, spoon-fed, I would say, where there's no participation, but it's listening. It's one method of learning. And if you actually combine the different methods, you'll see that you'll be able to springboard your learning of Gemara. One other announcement, or two small ones, there's bookmarks for each of the Masechtot, and the bookmarks for Nizikin, the whole Seder Nizikin, are still available. So if you'd like, you can, I just realized now I didn't open the order form, but the PDF of it is on the daf for today. And God willing, today I will open the order form so people can order Simaniyot if you don't have. Again, if you ordered already from the beginning of the Bavas, you have going through until we get to the next Seder. So if you don't and you're new and you want to order them, we'll send them to you. They're free of charge, and we're happy to send them to you. So with that, and one other thing, there's a study guide for today, something I try to do when I can, prepare a study guide which helps organize the Gemara for you so you can kind of look at it, sometimes with charts or with some sort of visual way of seeing the flow of the Gemara. And in those, you'll see that there's different colors and different fonts, and I use those to show the different layers of the Gemara, because the Gemara is made up of different layers, more layers than actually I show on the daf, on those study guides, but we can talk about at least some basic layers, which is that the Gemara is really a commentary on the Mishnah, but through that it often quotes psukim from the Torah, and it quotes Mishnayot or other content from the time period of the Mishnah, which is called the Tannaitic time period. So any Tannaitic material that's quoted in the Gemara, where you'll see some dapim where all they do is quote Tannaitic material and then kind of delve into it. So I put those in a different font so you have a differentiation between what's Tannaitic material and what's Amoraic material, which is who the rabbis of the Gemara are. Within the time of the Amoraim, there's also layers. I don't go that far on my sheets to start dividing between the layers of the different generations, but that's another thing one can do if one delves more in depth into it. And just to mention right now, a word that's going to come up all the time, which is a braita. So if we talk about Tannaitic material, where do we find Tannaitic material? There's a book called the Mishna, which most of us are familiar with, which is the main central book that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi put together. and organized material that was existing in his time period already, but kind of put it in a book. The same time, Rabbi Chia did that into the Tosefta. So we have the Tosefta, we have the Mishnah. It's always interesting. If you're interested in delving more, you can always compare. Like today, we're going to learn the entire parak of Mishnah. So if somebody wants homework and you want to look in the Tosefta, which you can easily find on Sefaria, for example, you can find the Tosefta there and you can compare, and it's very interesting to see. At the Siyum, I actually compared the first Mishnah to the Tosefta and showed that there's an opinion on the first line of the Mishnah that doesn't appear in the Mishnah, but appears in the Tosefta. There's a machloket there. Whereas our Mishnah makes it seem like everybody agrees. So it's always interesting to see. And there's what's called Braito. Bar is outside. So that's what the translation of the word bar means, like wild is bar. So it's anything that didn't make it into one of those books, but in the time of the Amoraim, they memorized these things. So they knew them and they're always bringing them into the conversation. So it's always important to know that there's different layers going on. It's important to distinguish. So those study guides also help with distinguishing the different layers. Okay, one more introduction. This introduction is going to be really about Sanhedrin. And I want to recommend recommended reading, which if you have the Koran Gemara, you can find it there. It's the introduction of Rabbi Steinsaltz to the Masechet. If not, you can find it online, and I put a link in the chat. If anybody needs it, you can let me know. I'll send it. But you can just look Introduction to Masechet Sanhedrin, Steinsaltz, and you will find it. And besides, we have great introductions on our site, one by Dr. Ayelet Libson and one by Gita Neufeld, and also from Rabbanit Shiur, Merily Mervis, and Chamutal Shoval. Lots of different introductions to the Masechet that you can find on our site. But I wanted to add to that, because those I'm hoping you're going to listen to, I wanted to add to that something that Rabbi Steinsaltz talks about in his introduction. So the main idea, and again, you'll have to read it if you really want to get more in depth, but he talks about that the Sanhedrin is like what Masechet Sanhedrin is essentially about is a discussion of the Jewish state and what an ideal Jewish state according to halacha would look like, okay, and should be. And basically, it's a lot about, and this is something I know Shiur and Chamutal spoke about in a daf of their own, which is content on our site. They talked about this idea of balance of powers, right? It's a big topic that everyone's discussing these days, both in Israel and America, around the world in general. It's a very big issue of balance of powers, and it's part of what the Gemara sets up also, or the system of halakha includes this idea of there's an executive branch, which is the king or the nasi, okay, which in the time of the Gemara was really the nasi. It was more a political leader, but also kind of rabbinic. We have the judicial branch, which is exactly what our Masechet's all about, the judiciary. And then we have the legislative branch. And that's a little more confusing because we don't, as Rabbi Steinsaltz says, that we don't really have a legislative branch. It's really our Torah is our legislation, although it's not exactly true, because the truth is the rabbis are also given the power to legislate, right? They're always creating laws, reinterpreting the laws. So to a certain extent, I think the rabbis are really also, there's the legislative branch. And if you notice, not all the rabbis were judges, right? So there's judges, and then there's the legislative branch. And but he points out, and he quotes a pasuk in Yeshayahu, a very beautiful pasuk, and kind of apropos this idea, in chapter 23, verse 22, it says, Ki Hashem shoftenu, Hashem mechokekenu, Hashem malkenu, hu yoshienu. They add kind of a fourth, which is interesting to think about. God is our judge. God is our legislator. Lechokek is the legislative. Hashem malkenu, God is our king. That's the executive branch. Hu yoshienu, he will be our savior, which is interesting. It's almost like having these three branches, right, will save us, or something like that. But anyway, putting the savior issue aside, it's basically the difference between a Jewish state operating lefi halacha, the way, again, I would say nowadays we have the opportunity for this really, but in the description in Sanhedrin, it's this ideal, but God is behind it. In other words, there's something about God that's operating behind all these ideas. It's not just humans coming up with a system of law from either basing it on some previous system of law, right? There's all sorts of ways, but it's all based on the original word of God. However, and there's a big however, and I'm not sure if we'll get to this today, but it's kind of the transition between today's daf and tomorrow's daf, I think is exactly this point that on the one hand, we're very much, right? This is a a God-given religion, God-given book of laws. However, lo b'shamayim, it's not in the heavens. And it's given to us to deal with. And it's one of the central issues in Sanhedrin that comes up. It comes up much later in the Zakeh Mamre Sugya about a person who decides, I don't agree with what the court says, one of the court judges, and makes a big deal and goes against. And we have this lo tasur min hadavar sheyidu l'cha yaminu small. Don't go right or left from what the courts tell you. You have to listen to everything they say. What if they tell you your right hand is your left hand and you know they're wrong, right? So how do you grapple with this? So there's all these issues that come up about, in the end, it's a human court. And that means, on the one hand, it's limited and mistakes can be made. And then how do we grapple with that? On the other hand, it gives the power to those living to be able to, as we talked about yesterday at the Siyum, Dinei Mamonot especially, or in general, the laws are a Mayan and Ovea. They're constantly moving, and there's constant movement in what's going on. And the rabbis are living in the time period that they're living, in the place that they're living, and need to sometimes make bold decisions and act as representatives of God, but taking the word of God and sometimes changing and interpreting it because they understand that based on the will of God, right, there's a need to change something. And that's a very interesting concept that's going to be raised, and already on the first daf it comes up. So we'll get to that hopefully, or at least we'll start with it at the end of today's daf. Okay, enough with introductions. You really want an overview of the Masechet, you should definitely go both to Gita's written introduction and to Ayelet's Shiur of introduction. And like I said, the other content also, like Shu and Chamutal talk about at least some perspective on the Masechet, though it's not meant to be, a real overview of the whole Masechet, which the others are really trying to be. Okay, with that, let's get started. As I said, we're now going to learn the entire chapter of Mishnah today. Okay, it's a little bit weird. Once in a while it happens in the Gemara. It has to do a little bit with how they decided to print, or I'm not sure if in the early manuscripts it appeared this way, probably. But someone decided, for, I don't know if it was intentional reason or not, but we're going to basically go through the entire chapter of Mishnah, and it's going to be a little frustrating. On the one hand, it's kind of nice because Mishnah is not as hard to understand, but it's a little frustrating because there's a million ideas in this one daf. And we're not going to really be able to delve into them very much, both because of time and because we don't yet know how to delve into them. We're going to have to wait for the Gemara to delve into them and explain them much more in detail. So we'll just touch them at the surface. And with that, we'll get started. Dinei mamonot b'shlosha. Monetary law, we judge with three. We have three judges. As I mentioned in the Siyum, Rebbe has an opinion we do five. But we're going to stick with what our Mishnah says for today. Dinei mamonot b'shlosha. Okay, and I think I said this at the Siyum, but if I asked you how many judges in each of the courts, right? There's the smaller courts that have three. This is something you might not have learned, but it's pretty basic if you learn anything about the Sanhedrin. Oh, I wanted to mention one other thing. Sanhedrin, the word Sanhedrin. So in the Greek, it means councils, which makes perfect sense. The Bartanura and some other commentaries on the Mishnah say it's actually an abbreviation for Sonei Hadrat Panim, those who hate people who favor people in judgment, and that's what the Sanhedrin stands for, this ideal, no bribery, no corruption kind of thing. To do that, you have to switch samach and sin, by the way, but that happens a lot, so it's not such a big deal, but it's obviously like a nice drush on the name, even though it really does come from the Greek. Okay, so dinei mamonot b'shlosha, monetary law with three. So I said there's three. There's courts of 23 and there's courts of 71. That's usually what you learn. It's either 3, 23, or 71, right? The 71 is the Sanhedrin Hagdolah, which sat in the Lishkat HaGazit, which was a chamber in the temple. We have, the smaller courts of 23, which are all in different cities. We'll see at the very, very end, the last Mishnah, at what point you determine that a city needs a court of 23, how many people. And then you have the courts of 3. Okay, it's like the same way you have a Supreme Court, district courts, right? There's federal court, district courts. There's all kinds of differentiations in halacha also, in the court system described in Sanhedrin. However, we're going to learn today that some people maybe thought 5, as I saw, that Rebbe says 5 people. In certain situations, there's people who think there's 5 or 7, or those numbers are not as clear cut that those are the only options. So let's get started. Dinei mamonot b'shlosha, monetary law with 3 judges. Gzelot v'chabalot b'shlosha, theft and injuries, personal injury, three people. Okay, this is going to sound a lot like a repetition of things we learned in Bava Kama specifically, in the beginning anyway. We're going to see later that Dine Mamonot they understand as a topic sentence. And then within Dine Mamonot, what Dine Mamonot do we do with three? The first thing the Gemara is going to say is something important is missing here, and why is it missing, and what's the ruling, why is it not here? We'll get to that. So Gzelot and Chabalot, like we said, theft and, okay, there's Gzela and Geneva. We'll talk about Geneva in a minute. But Gzela and Chabala and personal injury, b'shlosha. Nezek v'chatzi nezek. This is if your animal attacks somebody else. And if it was a short tam or a shor mu'ad, going back to Bava Kama, well, you determine that also b'shlosha. Tashlume kefel, but tashlume arba chamisha b'shlosha. This is if you steal. If you steal an item from someone, okay, there's a difference between gzela and geneva. If it's geneva, it falls in that category, you pay double payment. Or 4 or 5 times if it's a shor or a sef, it's a bull or a sheep. Those you pay 4 times or 5 times. That's all in the category, the kefel, arba chamisha, what we call knas, a penalty, a fine. Those things are also judged in a court of 3. Ha'ones v'hamifater. We're now moving topics. We're going back to tubot and things like that. If somebody rapes someone else, or mifater, or seduces, or motzi shemra, or someone tries to accuse his newly married wife as not being a virgin, and he's claiming that she actually had relations with someone while they were already betrothed, which would mean that if she's actually guilty, she gets the death penalty. But if he's guilty and he made it up just to humiliate her, he has to pay a payment. So these are all things that are payments, that are also fines, penalties, that the Torah actually gives an amount of what the person has to pay for those 3 things. Those are ruled in a court of 3, Divrei Rabbi Meir. Chachamim omrim, the rabbi said, what are you talking about? Now, you might know this, you might not, but I'll tell you that one of the main differences between the courts of 3 and the courts of 23 is that capital punishment is ruled in a court of 23. So the rabbi's saying, you might have thought about this already, based on what I told you, Motzi Shemra be'esrim v'shlosha, mipnei sheyesh bo dinei nefashot. Motzi Shemra can go one way, it'll be dini mamonot, the man has to pay, but if it goes the other way and she was actually guilty, since she was already betrothed to him, which according to the Torah, that's already designated, it's not like our engagement, but she's halachically engaged and already designated to him, if she sleeps with somebody else, she gets the death penalty, as does the person who she had relations with. That's a dinei nefashot case because she could get killed. So, of course, we're going to do that in 23. So the machloket, whether Motzi Shemra goes in 3 or 23. Makot b'shlosha. Okay, makot, and this is a good time to talk about Masechet Makot, which is our next Masechet. Makot is all sorts of punishment, all sorts of sins you do, where the punishment is lashes. Okay, we're going to get to Makot, and I'll already tell you now that just like the Bavas were all one big Masechet, Sanhedrin and Makot were also one big Masechet. Sanhedrin has 11 chapters, Makot has 3 chapters, but it was originally one big book, and then it was divided. And you'll see when we get to the later chapters, one of the interesting things about Sanhedrin is we jump from topic to topic, really. The beginning is all about the courts, but after that, we're going to get into a lot of other topics. And the reason is because they're going to start telling you who gets the death penalty of skila, who gets streifa, who gets chenek, who gets heret, all the different 4 kinds. Excuse me for a minute. And then they go into, well, if you did this, if you did that, and they start mentioning all sorts of sins. And then we get into and delve into like this whole chapter called Ben Sorer Moreh, because we're going to learn all about the Ben Sorer Moreh, who gets the death penalty. And then we want to delve into the laws about that. And then we jump from law to law. We'll learn about a false prophet. We'll learn about all sorts of different things. Someone who curses their parents. Okay. And we jump from topic to topic. Then Makot, so the chapters start, or the sections start with these Eluhain, these are those who get strangulation. These are those who get killed by this. And when you get to Makot, it also says, it's not actually how it starts, but Eluhain Halokin, these are those who get lashes. And then it goes to Eluhain Agolin, these are the ones who go to the Ir Miklat, to the refuge city. So it's the same structure, and it really is one continued long Masechet, but they divided it in 2. Okay, so Makot be'shlosha. But we're going to see also machloket here. Mishum Rabbi Yishmael Amru be'eslim b'shlosha. Some people say in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, it actually should be 23 because makot, lashes, it's perceived somewhat as almost like death. Okay, instead of killing you, though, we'll give you lashes, but maybe you were closer to deserving death, and therefore it's b'shlosha. Ibor hachodesh b'shlosha. That's when you determine that instead of having 29 days in a month, we're going to have it 30-day month, right? Some are 29, some are 30. This is what we call Kiddush HaChodesh. We learned about it in Rosh Hashanah, if you've been learning since then. Ibor Hashana B'Shlosha. And then there's a whole thing about intercalating the year, adding another month. This is how leap years work in Jewish calendar. We'll spend a lot of time on that and a bunch of dapim. Divrei Rabbi Meir. So those things are all done with 3, according to Rabbi Meir. It's very interesting. It's the only place where we seem to have this. You start dealing with 3. You then have discussions about it. This is all for the Ibor Shana to decide to do a leap year. Okay, this is if Pesach's going to come out too early, right? We push it off because it has to happen in Chodesh HaAviv. This is to combine, right? We have a lunar calendar, but we make corrections for it to connect with the solar calendar as well. We then have the discussions with 5, the Gomrim Mishiva, but when they judge, in the end, they have to have 7 who really rule in the end. But he does admit, though, if in the end it was only done with 3, it would be effective. But it should be done ultimately by 7. Smichat zakenim be'egla arufa b'shlosha divrei Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda omer b'chamisha. So now we have a machloket about this following: 3 or 5 for smichat zakenim or arifat egla. What is smichat zakenim? So the general opinion is that smichat zakenim is, Rashi says, al rosh par helim davar shel tzibur. When the Sanhedrin makes a mistake, I go back to the issue we were talking about before. Sometimes the Sanhedrin makes a mistake. If they teach something wrong and then the people follow that, you have to bring a special korban called a par helim davar shel tzibur. And the rabbis have to put their weight on the animal. That's called smicha. It's one of the things you do with some of the korbanot. And that has to be done in front of 3 or possibly 5, depending on which side you take in the machloket. Some people say smichat zakenim is giving smicha, like smicha for the Rabbanut. So their smicha was different than our smicha. Their smicha had much more power. It gave the rabbis a lot more power than we don't have smicha nowadays. There's a Hebrew, on the Hebrew side of our Shiur, of our website, there's a parallel of Beyond the Daf, Ora Ladaf, and there's a Shiur of Dr. Meirav Tupakana, which is not in English, but if your Hebrew is good, she talks all about this. If we don't have smicha anymore, then how do the courts have the power to rule? So, because that was one of the things that gave the judges power to rule. So perhaps smichat zakenim is talking about that. Do you have to do smicha of a rabbi in front of 3 or in front of 5? Arifat egla is when they do the egla rufa. That's when a body is found in between 2 cities and a dead body, and you don't know who, right? You don't know who killed the person, so you measure to the closest city, and then they have to do a whole ceremony. So the measuring of which city is responsible to do the egla rufa is done in front of 3 judges or perhaps in front of 5. Ha-chalitza v'ha-miunim b'shlosha. The woman has to do chalitza. This is when a husband leaves his wife without, right, dies without children, and the wife has to marry the brother. That's called yibum. But if she doesn't marry the brother, and nowadays we never do this, then she does a chalitza ceremony with the brother. That has to be done in front of 3 people. Miunim, a little bit more complicated, but if you learn in Seder Nashim, you'll probably remember this. It's a situation we've seen many times. It's where the father theoretically can betroth his minor daughter, and she's betrothed by Torah law. But if the father's not around or the father's not alive anymore, the mother or the brother can do this. This was a way to protect girls that they had shidduchim. Okay, it was actually a way to protect them. So they could marry them off, but it only has rabbinic validity. So because it's not a Torah kiddushin, she actually has a way to get out of it very easily. She could just say, I refuse to be married to this man. She has a window to do that until she's 12 or 12 and a half. There's a machloket about exactly how old she needs to be. But around the age of 12, until that age, she can say, I don't want to be in this marriage. But we now learn that has to be done in front of 3 people. Okay? Now, notice get is not mentioned here, divorce, okay? Only chalitza and miun, right? As Becky points out, I point out many times, but maybe there's people new here. Chalitza, unfortunately, is a very relevant issue nowadays with the war. It's unfortunately happened to many people where the husbands have died before they have any children. And a lot of women have had to undergo chalitza in recent times, many more so than, it does happen, but it's not the most common thing. But unfortunately, in time of war, it's very common. Divorce, some people say it's obvious. They didn't need to say it. If these have to be done in front of 3, of course, divorce has to be done in front of 3. But some people say, no, divorce doesn't have to be done in court. In fact, we've seen sugyot that mention that, not everybody goes to court to do divorce. Nowadays we do, but in those days, not necessarily. It could have been done otherwise. And perhaps because also it's written already. There's a written text, so maybe you don't need a ceremony. Whereas miyun, let's say, for example, she just says, no, I'm not interested. And chalitza, it's because it says in the Torah that they go in front of the ziknei ear. So therefore, it for sure has to be done in front of judges. These are two cases where you're supposed to bring your fruits to Jerusalem. One is the fourth year of your tree's produce, 4 years after you've planted it. You have to bring the fruits to Jerusalem and eat them in Jerusalem, but you can't always schlep all the fruits, so you turn it into money. Well, the redemption of this, the valuation, has to be done in front of a court of three. If you have Maser Sheni, which also it's the tithe, this one of the tithes you have to take, you bring it to Jerusalem to eat, so also you redeem it. But in the case of Maser Sheni, only if Ein Damav Yuduim, only if it's unclear what the price is. Like, for example, let's say they're already rotting, and you can't just go to the shuk and say what do tomatoes cost because your tomatoes have rotted. So you do it bishlosha. You do it with three judges. These are all valuations. So if you say I'm promising something to the temple, you have to do that in front of three. You have to evaluate what's it worth. If you do the erech of something, you say this value is I'm going to the temple. So if it's movable, three. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Chamehem Kohen. Rabbi Yehuda says based on the Torah, it talks about a Kohen. So one of them has to be a Kohen at least. If it's land that you did Erechinan, then Tisha Av Kohen. You need 9 people, plus, and one of them, you need, and in addition, a Kohen. You need 10 people altogether, but one of them being a Kohen. Va'adam kayotze behen. Also, if you give the value of a person, now there's 2 ways to give a value of a person. One is you say erech ploni alai, then it goes by the Torah. The Torah has a value system based on whether you're male or female, whether you're above or under 20 or 60. And then there's no valuation. But if you say demei ploni alai, the value of a person using a different word, not erech, but demei, then you actually have to evaluate what is that person worth in the shuk, how much would they go for if they were a slave and sold in the slave market. So that has to be done also in front of 10 people, one of them being a Kohen. Dinei nefashot. Okay, now we get to the second section. That was all dinei mamonot and other type of things that have to do with payments or maybe lashes. Right, as we saw, there was a machloket. Now we get to dinei mamonot, dinei nefashot, capital punishment. We're going to learn a lot about capital punishment in this Masechet, so we're going to get to that later. Okay, other people who get killed. If you have you have bestiality, which is a man or woman who engaged in sexual relations with an animal. Rovea is the man having sexual relation. An animal engaging in sexual relations with a woman. The nirba is the man who had. It's the animal who had sexual relations with the. No, 1 second. No, sorry. The rovea is a man who initiates sexual relations with an animal, and the nirba is the. Or maybe it's the animal. Okay, either which way, it's talking about 2 different relationships. The assumption is the man is the initiator, even if, whatever, it's not exactly clear who initiated, but in the act of the sexual act, the man is the initiator or the woman it's happening to her. But the issue is here, they're talking about both the animal and the person are judged in a court of Esrim B'Shlosha. How do we know this? Shneimar v'haragta et ha'isha ve'et ha'be'ema v'omer ve'et ha'be'ema ta'rogu. Okay, they skip part of the pasuk in the second one, but one is talking about the woman and the animal, and the other is talking about a man and an animal, and both the man and the woman are killed there, and the animal is killed as well. So because they're juxtaposed in the pasuk that the animal is killed and the man is killed, therefore, what they're trying to tell you here is that the animal is also judged in a court of 23, just like the person is going to be judged in the court of 23, because capital punishment for the person, also when we kill the animal, it's in a court of 23. Shur haniskal be'eschlim b'shlosha. This is another animal that gets killed. This is an animal that kills a person. So if Shur killed a person, an ox, gored a person and killed them, we kill the animal. How do we know it's Be'esrim B'Shlosha? Shene'emar, Hashur Yisakel v'gam ba'alav yumat. The ox gets stoned and the owner gets killed. Now, it's not true the owner gets killed because the next pasuk is, and you might remember from Bava Kama, the next pasuk is that, but you can pay your way out. Okay, it really means the person should get killed, but we're not going to kill you because in the end, you didn't kill the person directly. It was your animal, but you're responsible, sort of, you should be killed, but we're not going to kill you as long as you pay your way out. So, because they juxtapose in the pasuk, though, it sounds like the person should get killed and the shor should get killed. So therefore, kimitat ba'alim kach mitat hashor. So the shor gets killed just like the person. And not only a shor, but just so you should know, haze'ev v'hari, v'ado, v'anamer, v'bardilas, v'anachash, mitatam be'esrim v'shlosha. These are all different kind of animals that are dangerous animals. The wolf, the lion, the bear, the namer, bardilas are different types of leopards, and or cheetah, and a nachash and a snake. They also get killed in esrim v'shlosha. Now, here comes a really good, interesting line. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, kol hakodem laharagan zacha. Okay, we all know the problem of bringing something to court. It could take a while. You could have to wait online till your case comes up. In the meantime, these animals are out on the loose. Who knows what damage they could be doing? Forget doing it in a court of esrim v'shlosha. You don't even need a court. Whoever sees these animals should just kill them because it's a danger hazard to society. Rabbi Akiva Omer mitatam be'esrim v'shlosha. No, you can only kill them in a court of esrim v'shlosha. He disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer. Sounds like he's saying the same thing as Tanakama. We'll get to this when we get to the Gemara. Now, I just want to point out something structurally that's a little bit interesting about this Mishnah. The Mishnah starts off and says, Dinei mamonot b'shlosha, Dinei nefashot b'esrim v'shlosha, as if, explaining to you, this is what happens in this court, this what happens in this, and you would have expected, and the following happened in a court of 71. But now the Mishnah switches language, which I don't have an answer for this, but it's definitely interesting to think about. Starts saying, Ein danim, we don't judge lo et hashevet, velo et hanavi sheker, velo et kohen gadol, ela al pi beit din shel shevim ve'echad. Now we start to say we don't do these people's laws, though, or these situations, except in a court of 71. So everything we're going to hear about 71 is, well, this is done in a court of 71, but they're not going to say this is done, but we don't do this other than in a court of 71, which basically means this is what we do in a court of 71, but it's written in a bit of a strange language. So what's the shevet? So Rashi says, if most of the shevet worships avodah zarah, most of a tribe, and we will rule against that tribe, that happens in a court of 71. What you're going to see is these are all much more, I wouldn't say global issues, but national issues, I guess you could call them. Okay, where they affect a much larger range of people. A Navi Sheker. Now, even though a Navi Sheker is one person, a false prophet, but it's something that affects a lot of people. Probably the idea is also it has to be publicized. And in the court of 71, whatever they would hear, right? Like we hear about Supreme Court rulings. We don't hear about small court rulings at all. Lo et Kohen Gadol, okay, if the Kohen Gadol does something wrong, does a big serious offense, then also has to be ruled in the court of 71. Who decides if we go out to war, a voluntary war, not a mechemet mitzvah, but a mechemet reshut? Also, al pi beit din shel shevim ve'echad. Court of 71 determines that. We can't change or talk about where exactly the boundaries of Jerusalem are, because this affects all sorts of sacrificial meats have to be eaten in the city of Jerusalem. Maser sheni has to be eaten in the walls of Jerusalem. Neta revai. How do we determine what is Jerusalem? Only the 71, the court of 71. And the Azarot, what's considered the Azara in the temple. Also, there's all sorts of rules about who can go into the Azara, what has to be eaten in the Azara. So that's also only a Beit Din of Shevim Ve'echad. Ve'ein osim Sanhedrin l'shvatim. How do we determine what city needs a 23, or who determines? We can say, we're going to put another Sanhedrin in this area of 23. That's only up Beit Din shel Shevim Ve'echad. So the 71 decide where we're going to put up these smaller courts. Also, if you have a city who all go and worship idols, city gets destroyed, their property gets destroyed, that's also 71. If we're already on the topic of Irani Dachat, some other things about Irani Dachat, you don't do an Irani Dachat, you can't make it an Irani Dachat if it's on the border with a Gentile town. Okay, we'll have to see this all later in the Gemara. Velo shalosh, you can't do three cities adjacent to each other. And, excuse me. But you do one or two. That's a bit weird if it says we don't do three adjacent. Obviously, you can only do one or two. A bit of a question why it says that. Okay, now we're going to start finding out how we got to this 23 and 71. The assumption is 3 is kind of obvious. Even though Rebbe says 5, but they don't even ask about 3. But Sanhedrin, now we're going to see how we get to 71 and how we get to 23. Where do we see a source for this in the Torah? Sanhedrin So, right, we already know this, but the big one was 71. The smaller one, again, not the smallest, they're kind of ignoring the 3 right now, was 23. How do we know 71? Where did we get to that magic number from? Shenemal esfali shivim ish misiknei Israel and Bamidbar. Remember, Moshe is told, go gather 70 of the Zkenim, and they're going to help you rule the people. Moshe al gabehen, and Moshe was in charge, so there you have Moshe and the 70. That gets you to 71. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Shivim. He says no, it's only 70 because Moshe, it doesn't count in the count. Either he didn't rule with them or he just wasn't, right. It's not like he sat together with them. He was in charge of them. That's different. He doesn't count as part of the 71, and therefore he thinks it should be 70 judges. Where do we get to 23? Shenemal. Now, if in the section in Bamidbar chapter 35, it talks about murder, and it differentiates between accidental murder and intentional murder. And it says there, V'shaftu ha'edah, the people have to rule about whether this person's innocent or guilty. Shaftu sounds like they judge, and that's kind of those saying this person's guilty. And then it says v'hitzilu ha'edah. But then it says, and then they save this person, meaning they say, oh no, it was only an accident, and then they sent him back to the refuge city. So here comes the drasha. V'shaftu ha'edah, v'hitzilu ha'edah. Edah shofetet ve'edah matzelet. They view this as there's one edah which is on one side, there's the other which is on the other. One is trying to convict, and one is trying to say the person's innocent. Hare kanasrim. So we have an edah on one. Edah is 10. In a minute we'll see how do we know edah is 10. 10 pulling one way, 10 pulling the other way, and this is obviously dinei nefashot, right? It's capital punishment because it's a murder. That's 20. We have to get to 23 also, but first we're going to explain. How do we know an edah is 10? And this comes up in a whole bunch of places. This is how we get to minyan is 10. Until when are we going to have such, right? We have such a bad edah here. What is this saying, right? How bad are these people? Who is it talking about? The spies. How many spies were there? There were 12. But Yatsu, Yoshua, and Kalev, they weren't bad. They were on the other side. So you have 10. And from there we have each edah is 10. You have 10 and 10. Now we have to get to 23. Well, there's a pasuk that says, don't follow the majority for bad. Okay, which, if you're going to use this in court, what do you mean? You're going to follow the minority to be bad? It's a little bit strange. And it sounds like you can follow the majority for good, just not for bad. So that means not to convict, but yes, to exonerate someone. But then there's a different pasuk that says we follow the majority. You don't need that pasuk if you already can infer that from the other pasuk. To which they answer, and plus what? What does it mean? Lo tia rabim l'ra'ot. So the answer is lo katayatech l'tova tayatech l'ra'ah. It's different, the majority, when you want to convict than it is when you want to exonerate someone. Hatayatcha l'tova al pi echad. Hatayatcha l'ra'ah al pi shnayim. If you want to go and convict someone, you have to have a majority of two people. Meaning, this is what we talked about the tennis at the Siyum, right? In tennis, to win, you have to win by 2 points. You can't just win by 1 point. To convict someone, and this is what we saw in Rebbe's opinion, why he needed 5 judges. Well, here it comes up as the standard opinion for 23. Because you have 10 on one side, 10 on the other. That was the edah shofetet edah matzelet. Even though obviously once you have 23, it's not going to end up exactly like that. But the way the pasuk describes it, there's 10 on one side, 10 on the other. And now if you want to convict, though, you're going to need at least 2 more to go on the side of the one trying to convict. So you get to 22. Right, so again, the Tayat Chalara has to be by 2, turning out to Amubet. Ve'ein beitin shakul, and you can never have an even number of judges, even though you might have noticed that the 70 is an even number. But you can have an even number of judges. Mosifim alehem od echad harei kan esrim b'shlosha. That's how we get to 23. So you have to add 1 more to make it an uneven number. V'kamiyeh ba'ir last Mishna, what will be, how many people do you have to have in the city? Etei ruyah Sanhedrin, and then you have to start putting up these beitin of 23. 120 people. Already at 120 people, we require a court of 23. Rabbi Nechemia Omer, 230 keneged sarei asarot. If you remember in the Torah, there's these sarei asarot and sarei me'ot. There's people who are in charge of every 10 people, people in charge of every 100 people. That was the whole system that Yitro suggested. So Rabbi Nechemia says you have to have, it's sarei asarot are the lowest. That's 1 for every 10 people. So if you have a court of 23, it has to be over 230 people, not over 120 people. And therefore he says only when you have 230 people do you put in a Sanhedrin Tana. Okay. Now let's get to the Gemara. So that was all the Mishnayot of the chapter. Like I said, that was a lot of information. You can see already my throat is hoarse from saying all the information. It's a lot of words. Don't worry if you didn't follow every single case. every single case here, we're going to go in depth. So have no worries. I saw people were writing, was here any dachad, or I don't know. I wasn't exactly following the chat, but everything here we're going to go in depth. So no worries. The first question the Gemara asks is really on that dinim amonot shlosha, and then it starts with gzelot v'chavalot. So atu gzelot v'chavalot lav dinim amonot ninhu. In other words, gzelot v'chavalot is already included in dinim amonot. Dinim amonot is a category of any kind of financial issues. So why are you then specifying gzelot v'chavalot if you already said dinim amonot? Amar Rabbi Avau mahin katani. This should be read as, and sometimes that's what the Gemara does, how to read this Mishnah, kind of how to punctuate it. This should be read as dinim amonot is the topic sentence, and then it goes into what are dinim amonot of shlosha, not all dinim amonot of shlosha. And that's going to be strange. What are they then? And we're going to get into that. But mahin dinim amonot, gzelot v'chavalot. What is considered dinim amonot? Theft and injuries. Aval hodaot v'halvaot lo. Notice what's missing in the Mishnah. If you take out a loan or admit you own a loan, you owe money, or if someone comes to say you owe me money, pay me back, that's not mentioned in the Mishnah. Now, that's strange. So why isn't it mentioned here? But what they're trying to say is it's not included in the Mishnah on purpose. It's not in front of 3. Okay, that's going to be confusing. And how many is it in front of? We don't know yet. We'll get back to that. First, they're going to say utsricha. Why did they need to have dinei mamonot b'shlosha in the Mishnah and gzelot v'chavalot? Maybe you would have assumed, what if you just wrote gzelot v'chavalot? You would assume, okay, well, you didn't write hodot v'halvaot, so it must be out also. So why do you need this structure of both saying the topic sentence and then specifying gzelot v'chavalot in order to exclude hodot v'halvaot? And right now we're assuming it's clear they're excluded. The question is, why the Mishnah have to be written in this way? Well, tzricha, it was necessary because itana dinei mamonot. Let's say it just said dinei mamonot. Obviously, you know what we would have thought. Hava mina afilu hodot v'halvaot, and that's why tana gzelot v'chavalot. If you just had dinei mamonot, you would have assumed it included hodot and halvaot. So therefore, it said dinei mamonot gzelot v'chavalot to teach you it's definitely not hodot and halvaot. But what if it just said gzelot v'chavalot? Then maybe you would have known. Well, itan gzelot v'chavalot v'lo katani dinei mamonot, but they didn't say dinei mamonot. Hava amina huadin afilu hodot v'halvaot. You might have thought that it just said gzelot v'chavalot as an example, but obviously also hodot and halvaot. Now, if so, why would it have specifically said gzelot v'chavalot and not, right again, theft and personal injury rather than saying admissions and loans? Well, the reason is mishum de'hai katana gzelot v'chavalot, even though it really meant everything. And this is all in what you would have thought and why they had to say it in a different way. Mishum de'ikar shlosha diktive b'gzelot v'chavalot ktive. There's psukim, okay, where it talks about in gzelot specifically. It says, "V'nikrav balabayit el Elohim," and in the next pasuk, the word Elohim is mentioned another 2 times. Now, the word Elohim in the Torah often means God, but in certain contexts, specifically in Shemot Kaf Bet, mentioned a bunch of times, it means going to the judges. The judges are also called Elohim, and it says Elohim 3 times. That's where we get 3 judges from. Even though the Mishnah didn't say so, now they're telling you it's derived from these 3 mentions. And the topic is theft. So because the topic's theft, that's why they use that as the example in the Mishnah. But it means perhaps that it's for any other thing like hodot and halvaot as well. Again, we're still in what you might have thought. What about chavalot? Why is chavalot mentioned? Well, chavalot, mali chaval begufo, mali chaval b'mamono. An injury to your body is kind of like an injury to your money, right? It's either your money or your body. Those are 2 ways of injuring someone, right? Some people it's worse for their body. Some people it's worse if you take their money. And they're like, hit me, I don't care, but don't take my money. Some people are like, take my money, but don't hurt me. So they're basically sort of equal. So that's how we would get to gzelot v'chavalot. So the main topic is in gzelot, and that's why they mention gzelot, and chavalot is like gzelot. But you would have thought it includes everything else. And therefore, tana mahin dinei mamonot, gzelot v'chavalot, aval hodaot v'halvaot lo. And that's why it says, what are dinei mamonot? They're gzelot v'chavalot, but not hodaot and halvaot. And that's what we learned from the Mishnah. So now the Gemara says, okay, hodaot and halvaot are on the outs, so elalamai. What are they excluded for? For what law? Right? The obvious is maybe you don't need 3 judges. You could do it in front of 1 or 2. But that can't be because Hama Rabbi Avau said, Shnaim shedanu dinei mamonot l'divrei akol ein dineim din. Rabbi Avau says very clearly, if 2 people ruled in a case, it's not valid. We'll see there's different opinion about this, but he says no way, no how. So it can't possibly be the hodaot and halvaot are okay with less than 3. Ela de lo be'ina mumchim. And now we start with this topic that we're going to talk about a lot. You don't need experts. When you say court in the Gemara, sometimes it means a court of real judges. Sometimes it means just three people. Like when we do Hatarat Nedarim, for example, we come in front of a court to do it. But in shul, we just take any three people. We don't take special judges, special rabbis, something like that, anybody. So what it's telling you is Hoda'ot v'Hava'ot can be judged in front of anybody. Zeilot v'Chavalot have to be in front of professional judges. That's the difference. So now the Gemara wants to know, how do you get to this? My kasavar. Where'd you come up with this distinction? Now they're going to bring two possibilities and say it doesn't work for either possibility. Because if you say ikasavar eruv parshiot katuvkan, you have to understand what eruv parshiot is. In Shmot Kafbet, as I mentioned, it's where we get the reference for Gzelot, three people. And we learned three specialists. And then later on in that chapter, it says if you lend money to someone, and it talks about loans. So if you view this whole as one continuum, this whole section, right? This reminds me of the previous stuff that we just learned in Bava Batra about having the vav and connecting, or no vav and not connecting. Anyway, if you don't know what that is, don't worry. But if you say we're going to connect as if the whole parsha is one thing, libai nami mumchin, then for loans, it should be the exact same thing. Just like you need three specialists there, you need three specialists here. If you're going to say they're two separate things, then then you shouldn't need three. So basically, this is asking in a more complicated way, but just simply either it's the same or it's different. If it's different, it should be completely different. If it's the same, it should be completely the same. How do we get to this in between? To which they answer, and we're going to only start their answer, and you're going to have to wait in suspense. It's a very interesting answer, and it's what I referenced in the beginning of class. It really is all one section, which means bidinhu, by law of the Torah, and this is where it gets very interesting, and I'm going to leave you hanging. Dilibai nami mumchim. By Torah law, really, you need specialists. V'hai delo be'ina mumchim mishum de Rabbi Chanina. And the only reason you don't need mumchim, you really need mumchim for hoda'ot and hava'ot, for loans. And theoretically, it should have been in the Mishna by Torah law. But came Rabbi Chanina and said something great. Rabbi Chanina said we need to make a change. We need to change from the Torah law. And I'm going to leave it here and we're going to read what Rabbi Chanina says tomorrow. I'm going to leave you hanging, but this is a great example. I told you right on the first daf they get into that there's Torah law and then the rabbis have the power sometimes to change that. And that's really what's at the crux of this Masechet. So quick review. For those who are new, I like to review the daf as best as I can at the end of class. We're running a little late, so I'll do this pretty quickly. Also, it's a little hard to review the stuff because I can't go into every single thing that we did because we did a lot of different topics. But we started with what's ruled, if you want to say it in simple terms, what goes into a court of 3, what goes into a court of 23, what goes into a court of 71, what's the source for 23 and 71, how many people do you need in a city to require a court of 23? And we saw that there were some different opinions about perhaps there's also sometimes 20, there's 5, there's 7 different numbers. And we'll get to more of that in the Gemara as well. And we talked about a wide range of topics over the course of the next 16, 17 dapim. We're going to delve into these topics. And then the main thing we started with was the first few words of the Mishnah, how it's read. We read it as topic sentence. These are dinei mamonot. Within dinei that need 3, within dinei mamonot that need 3, these are the things. Meaning not hoda'ot and hava'ot. Why are they not on the list? Because even though they do need 3, they don't need specialists. Why is that? You'll have to wait till tomorrow to see. With that, wishing everyone a good day and welcome to Masechet Sanhedrin.